All right, everyone, in the interest of time, let's get started. All right. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the Archives and Special Collections Department, welcome to First Fridays. I am Linnea Anderson, a member of the First Fridays Committee. Welcome back to our regular guests, and a special welcome to any who are with us for the first time. Can we see a show of hands? If this is the first time you've visited with us? Terrific. And we do appreciate you making your way here through highway construction and parking lot construction, you name it. Just a note for everyone, we are being live streamed on the library's YouTube channel, and the program is also being recorded and will be available to watch there later as well. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former library director Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Library's archives and special collections. This year's theme is We Are Here, Women in the Archives, focusing on female identifying stories. Today's presentations focus on special collections and rare books and the Upper Midwest Literary Archives. The lunch you are enjoying is from Pizza Luce. After the program, we will have a tour with Chris Kiesling. Chris is in the back there, so if you're interested in seeing the rest of the facility, please join Chris after the program. And before we move on, we have a short announcement from Kirsten Clark regarding Friends of the Libraries. Kirsten, come on up.
Well, welcome everybody. My name is Kirsten Clark. I work here in the libraries, but I am also on the libraries, Friends of the Library Board here. And so I just wanted to give also a welcome from us as well. Certainly your presence here speaks to your interest in the many resources that the university libraries offer, both to the university, the public, and to the state of Minnesota. Another area of support that we have, and this especially ties into the First Fridays because a lot of the collections that you'll be seeing over the course of this year have their own friends groups. And I'll just mention those quickly. There is information about all of those groups at the back table. We have the Associates of the James Ford Bell Library, the Treader Collection, the Curlin Friends. Sorry, I was waiting for Lisa to do her shout out there. Is she in the room? No. Thank you. Friends of the Anderson Horticultural Library, Friends of the Sherlock Holmes Collection, and then we have our larger Friends of the Libraries group that supports all the collections across the libraries. The last thing I just want to mention, because I know you all want to get in and hear from our presenters today, is we actually have a presentation for the Friends coming up on December 5th. Is entitled Me Too. It's about the Me Too movement, monumental or momentary. And we'll have Professor Emeritus, Dr. Sarah Evans, who's been here at the university. Her area of interest is women's history, and a panelist coming to talk about that topic and pull together a lot of what's happening right now and what does it mean in terms of the history of women's movement in the United States. So that's going to be December 5th at 7 p.m. at Kaufman Theater. If you didn't get that down, there's a bookmark at the back of the room that you can also pick up that has that information. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Our first presentation is The Passionate, Accurate Story, Women Writers at Work by Kathryn Hujda, Assistant Curator of the Upper Midwest Literary Archives. This talk explores the legacy of author Carol Bly and the often unseen work of women writers, publishers, and editors.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today, on this sort of dreary afternoon. As Linnea mentioned, I'm Kate Hujda, and I'm the Assistant Curator for the Upper Midwest Literary Archives here at the U. And our collection is dedicated to providing access to archival collections that document Minnesota and the Upper Midwest's exceptional literary legacy. We preserve the archives of some of the most notable writers in our region, including the papers of author, teacher, and mentor Carol Bly, which she donated to the Upper Midwest Literary Archives in 2003, just a few short years before she passed away in 2007. Carol Bly was born Carolyn McLean to Charles and Mildred McLean in Duluth, Minnesota in 1930. This is Carol circa 1947, just 17 years old. Though born in Duluth, she spent most of her childhood in North Carolina, where she was later sent to live after her mother died of tuberculosis when Carol was just 12 years old. After finishing high school out east, Bly earned dual bachelor's degrees in English and history in 1951 and spent several years working in New York and Boston before taking graduate-level classes at the U of M in 1954. She married in 1955 and soon after moved to her husband's family farm near the small rural town of Madison, Minnesota. It was while living in Madison that Bly served as the manager for the literary magazine and publisher 50s Press, later known as the 60s and the 70s Press. While living in Madison, Bly was asked to write a monthly column, A Letter from the Country, for Minnesota Public Radio magazine. In this column, Bly related stories from her own experience living in the small town of Madison. The essays were later compiled into what would become her first book, Letters from the Country, published in 1981. When the book was republished by the U of M Press in 1999, Carol stated that her original aim for the column was to, quote, mosey through my thoughts about farmstead life and small town life, to see how the personality lives, well in some ways, poorly in others, and to bear in mind this question: if every human being wants to live up to full species potential, how do we slog away at the inner work, no matter where we live? Over the course of her lifetime, she published numerous other books, both fiction and nonfiction. This list here, amazingly, is just a sampling of her work. And along with writing extensively, Carol Bly was also a small business owner. That business? Custom Crosswords. Custom-made crossword puzzles for sales meetings, conventions, magazines, fundraising, and personal celebrations such as birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, and more. Though Carol herself admitted that she had never finished a crossword puzzle in her life, her business, Custom Crosswords, claimed that there was no group so obscure, nor individual so erudite, that Custom Crosswords couldn't tackle penning an appropriate puzzle. And, of course, we have some of these puzzles in her archives. This one here was created specifically for the 1988 Minnesota Festival of the Book, and a majority of all of the clues and the answers relate to Minnesota literary life in some way. And so if you'll all just indulge me for a few minutes. 32 down, 5 letters. Clue, a good Minnesota helper if you want to write. 5 letters, good Minnesota helper if you want to write. Hint, it's a Grey Wolf book now, if you want to write. Euland, yeah! Woo! The answer, Brenda Euland, wrote If You Want to Write, was first published in 1946 and was later republished by local publisher Grey Wolf Press. 76 across, 4 letters. Nancy Carlson's sibling characters, Harriet and Walt. Nancy Carlson's sibling characters, Harriet and Walt, 4 letters. Looking to my friends in the Children's Literature Archives on this one. Yeah, dogs, I heard it. Harriet and Walt are dog characters. Nancy Carlson is a children's book author, and we have her papers here at the university in the Children's Literature Research Collection. Dogs, sorry. They are dog characters. Okay, last one, and then I'll move on. So last one. This one is hard. I had to Google it, so fair warning. 55 across, 6 letters. Minnesota's Borgid Dahl wrote bravely without it. Yeah, vision, yes. Awesome, vision. So Borgid Dahl was born in Minneapolis in 1890 to Norwegian immigrants. And as a young child, she suffered with severely impaired vision. Stories say that in order to read, she had to hold books so close to her eyes that her eyelashes brushed the pages. But despite this, Dahl attended college and received her bachelor's degree from the University of Minnesota in 1912, which is several years before women had the right to vote in the state. and she taught at several Midwest high schools before earning a graduate degree in 1923. She became a professor at Augustana College in Sioux Falls and wrote 16 books for young people, books which all draw heavily on her experience as the daughter of Norwegian parents living in the Midwest. But back to Carol and her writing. As I mentioned, her output included collections of short stories, nonfiction essays, and several books on the topic of writing. Perhaps one of her more well-known books was this book here, The Passionate Accurate Story, which was published by local publisher Milkweed Editions in 1990 and was the winner of a Minnesota Book Award. Topics in this book include making your own fresh assessments of places, eschewing collective opinion, keeping good tone despite the dialogue, planning the eventual death of each character for plot use and for our own psychological clarity, and ugly facts of our time and our sense of public concern. The book also offered just a bit of discussion regarding the actual mechanics of writing, word choice, sounds, etc., what Carol referred to as only small cures. Rather than concentrate on the technical or mechanical aspects of writing, Carol Bly advocated for storytelling that was morally, politically, ethically, and emotionally deep. All of her books on this topic, of which there are several, tended to encourage students to use a sort of empathetic questioning method in order to uncover their strongest feelings and amplify those feelings through their writing. In this sense, this book offered not only reflections on writing and the craft of storytelling, but also served to introduce Carol's larger vision of the role of literature and storytelling in society to the world. I first fell in love with Carol's work while actually working in a different archive, the papers of poet Bill Home. As some of you may remember, 2 years ago I did a presentation during the same series where I focused on all the letters that had been sent to Bill over the course of his life. And in his papers there was this one letter in particular that really struck me, and it was a letter from Carol, written when she was back in Madison, working as the manager of the then 70s Press and writing her monthly column. And in this letter, she urged Bill to stop mimicking the work of other more notable poets and instead encouraged him to find his own unique voice. She wrote, "Listen, dear Bill, you don't have to echo anybody." And she and Bill remained close friends and correspondents, with Carol always needling Bill, always pushing him in his writing. For example, many of Bill's poems refer to rural life and his experiences in his own small town of Minneota, Minnesota. Carol questioned this practice. In this letter, dated 1989, she writes, "I don't know, Bill. Whenever I think of your work, I am always surprised by how good it is despite your constant projection on your own hometown," which she had underlined for emphasis. She continued, "What if your commonality has nothing to do with Minneota? What if you could be making major cultural helps if you didn't let yourself spend 8 minutes a day, not even 8 minutes, goofing around talking about Minneota? How about knocking it off?" And I didn't really know it at the time, but now that I'm more acquainted with Carol's work, it's really quite amazing to see how her public advice to writers was so true to the private and personal advice she shared among close friends. Carol was honestly interested in encouraging writers to create works that connected with people on that deeper emotional level. And it was reading Carol's correspondence with Bill Home that really got me thinking about the unseen labor of writers, and women writers in particular. The informal private advice shared between friends, the behind-the-scenes editorial work, the community building through organizing readings or other public events. And though writers themselves may from time to time share these stories in their own writing or in interviews or public appearances, their archives often offer a fuller, richer story than what goes to print. Which brings me to Carol's relationship with editor Emily Buchwald, co-founder of Milkweed Editions. The two had a long and fruitful relationship, with Milkweed publishing several of Carol's books. In fact, Carol's first book with Milkweed, Backbone, secured a review from the New York Times, which helped establish Milkweed as a major publisher of books. But perhaps the most challenging collaboration between Bly and Buchwald was the publication of this book here, Changing the Bully Who Rules the World, Reading and Thinking About Ethics. The idea for this book began years before it was published, starting its life as the Milkweed Ethics and Literature Anthology, a book to be compiled and edited by Carol Bly with commentary from Bly. Over the course of correspondence exchanged between Emily and Carol, the scope of the book began to narrow and crystallize. Carol strongly believed that bullies exist in adult society as, quote, bosses, partners, governments, and corporations who abuse their power for personal gain or at the expense of innocent people. Most people accept bullying as unexplainable or just the way things are. This book then was meant to question society's acceptance of bullies and to provide practical, thoughtful essays with generous selections from contemporary novelists and poets on taming the bullies in our lives. Once the scope had been defined, numerous drafts were passed between Emily and Carol, as well as other editors at Milkweed. These pages here are from a draft dated May 1994. And Milkweed's archives include letters upon letters upon letters exchanged between Emily and Carol, the two slowly shaping the book together, hand in hand, writer and editor. The archives also include what must have been a particularly painful letter for both writer and editor. In October 1994, just months before the book was intended to go to print, Emily pulled it. She thought that the book still needed more work. She wrote to Carol, quote, "What's the solution? The book needs to go on a back burner. I respect your desire to take Changing the Bully elsewhere if that is your wish, but I am not giving up on this book, Carol. I just know that it makes no sense to publish it now." Which must have been a terribly hard decision to make. Not good for the press, by no means, not good for her relationship with Carol. But reading these letters, you can see that Emily truly cared about the book and about Carol as a person, as a writer, and that she was trying to do what was best for both the press and for her friend. And so another round of edits, more letters exchanged. These pages are from December 1995, which is just a little over a year after Milkweed had halted publication. And in 1996, when Milkweed finally did publish Changing the Bully, Buchwald called it a masterpiece that was ahead of its time. It was used in classrooms around the country. Critics called it unique and wonderful, astonishing, spirited, intelligent, and witty, asserting that Bly was a one-woman army fighting moral drift and the bullies of the world, her analysis complex, incisive, and hopeful. And we see these sorts of intimate relationships among writers and editors and writers and other writers play out not just in Carol's collection, but in other archival collections as well. And the Upper Midwest Literary Archives have been striving to document some of the less public roles women often play in creating and shaping a literary community, collections that speak to some of that unseen labor we've been talking about. Some of our most recent acquisitions include a collection from poet Morgan Grace Willow, who played an instrumental role in bringing poetry to new audiences through the Poetry in Motion program, which places poetry posters on transit buses. And her collection also contains documentation of a collaboration with the Metro Deaf School in St. Paul, and her larger efforts to make literary events more accessible to those that are deaf and hard of hearing. We also recently welcomed a collection from Sing Heavenly Muse, which was an independent literary magazine and publisher founded by poet and editor Sue Ann Martinson. The magazine published numerous women writers from across the nation, and they also hosted this local series of readings, Women's Work, which featured writers such as Phoebe Hansen, Patricia Hampel, Andisha May Holland, and Deborah Keenan. And the papers of Deborah Keenan herself also arrived in the last few months. Her archives include correspondence, book publicity, beautiful broadsides, and records from the Laurel Poetry Collective, which she founded. And her collection also includes a few quite wonderful letters from Carol Bly. In fact, in Keenan's archives, there's a letter from Carol dated 1985 praising Keenan's work. It reads, quote, "I am reading your book now, and I think it is so wonderful. It is wonderful. I told you years ago that you had this huge, non-Twin Cities usual sort of gift, and it is getting clearer and clearer. I love your poetry. I'm delighted you have come into your talent now, and I'm glad you are doing major work now. which I thought was pretty different from the tone in her letters to Bill. And last but not least, we also recently welcomed a collection from a local literary magazine, Paper Darts, which was founded in 2009 and is still at work today. The editors of Paper Darts seek to publish innovative and entertaining storytelling, underrepresented voices, both in writers and in characters, inclusive feminism, accessibility, boundary pushing, and norm challenging stories. Yes, all of that. And each of these new collections coming in, each has been so exciting and unique and adds dimension to our collection that wasn't there before. But there is still so much work left to be done. There are so many voices that we desperately want to represent in the Upper Midwest Literary Archives to preserve for future generations for years to come. And our staff is continuing to work towards acquiring collections that document a broader picture of literary life in our state. Because so often, it's only through a writer's archives, by searching for that often unseen work, that we can truly begin to tell the passionate, accurate story. Thank you. One more thing. Sorry, I forgot. If you'd like to take a stab at the crossword puzzle on your own, I have copies up front.
Thanks, Kate. Our second presentation is Women for McCarthy by Tim Johnson, Curator of Special Collections and Rare Books, and the E.W. McDermott Curator of the Sherlock Holmes Collection. In 1958, Abigail McCarthy organized a political group, Women for McCarthy, in support of her husband's U.S. Senate race. A decade later, this organization, now national in scope, energized Eugene McCarthy's presidential campaign. This presentation explores the role of women during this significant moment in American history.
Well, first of all, for those of you who bleed maroon and gold, who might be here for homecoming, welcome back. I hope you have a good homecoming weekend. When Eugene McCarthy was elected to Congress in 1948, his wife Abigail was his most important supporter. A decade later, as part of her husband's campaign for the Senate, Abigail organized women across the state under the banner Women for McCarthy. By the time of Senator McCarthy's presidential bid in 1968, Women for McCarthy was a national reality, or as might have been said at the time, a happening. 33 days away from one of our most important elections in recent years, in a campaign season wherein a record number of women, 524 as of September 13th, threw their hat into the ring for the U.S. House and Senate races, it is more than appropriate for us to spend a few minutes looking at a movement that made this possible. In her article, Women in the 1968 Eugene McCarthy Campaign and the Development of Feminist Politics, historian Mary Linehan makes this observation. Although their candidate lost the nomination, these women believed theirs was a victory with life-changing implications. McCarthy women confidently moved forward in the political realm because the movement encouraged and valued women's ways of organizing, empowered them with unprecedented opportunities for leadership and influence, and taught them to question the limits sexism placed on women's political participation. They created a democratic feminist politics that endures today. The National Women's Political Caucus, Emily's List, and the careers of Barbara Boxer and Hillary Rodham Clinton are only part of this legacy. And by the way, all of this is coming from the Eugene J. McCarthy Papers, a collection that documents his presidential campaigns and also includes his literary papers. During the 1968 presidential campaign, Abigail McCarthy made speeches and personal appearances, took countless calls from staffers and supporters, reviewed campaign literature, and organized mailings. There were thousands of women behind her in this effort. According to one estimate, more than 400,000 women campaigned for McCarthy in 1968. What I'd like to do is take a little bit of a peek at who these women were and what they accomplished. First, a few chronological markers, just to kind of set the context. So most of these dates are 1968. You have McCarthy entering the race in November 67, and then you have the primary seasons beginning with New Hampshire, going on to Wisconsin after LBJ drops out, assassinations of Dr. King and Senator Kennedy, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and then the November election. We begin, of course, with Abigail McCarthy. Born Abigail Quigley in Wabasha, Minnesota, she graduated in 1936, Phi Beta Kappa from the College of St. Catherine, now St. Catherine's University in St. Paul. She received her MA from the University of Minnesota in 1942 and did postgraduate work at the University of Chicago and the Middlebury School of English. Abigail met Gene while working as a teacher in Mandan, North Dakota. After their marriage in the summer of 1945, they settled in Watkins, Minnesota. In an open letter to supporters penned in the early months of the campaign, Abigail wrote, "Dear women from McCarthy, I cannot even claim to be the first woman from McCarthy because when Gene stepped forward, you were there to help him. It is hard for me to remember how filled with anxiety, how frustrated, how helpless in the face of our drift towards disaster at home and abroad we were just short months ago. I cannot help feeling that one man taking one step, regardless of risk, has made the difference. Now responsible debate is taking place. The political process is working again. The young have hope and have re-entered the mainstream. Women everywhere are in the forefront of the presidential campaign effort. We are no longer in politics as a minority striving for equality, nor are we there only as persons and as citizens. It seems to me that Gene has become a symbol of reason, of reconciliation, and of renewed energy in our society. He needs you, not only to help him win, but to help him fulfill his promise to the people of the country." A campaign staff, loosely organized, but nonetheless staff, coalesced around McCarthy with June Open-Degnan, a San Francisco political activist and literary figure serving as the campaign's national finance director. Shortly after McCarthy announced his candidacy, Degnan wrote a check for $5,000, the first external contribution to the campaign. "I would have supported King Kong," she said, "if he'd run against Johnson." By the end of the campaign, June Degnan gave $60,000 of her own money and raised another $2 million. Mimsy Mazel, a graduate student at Penn State University, left school, joined the campaign during primary season, and worked in the press office. One of her jobs involved catching local press attention by crafting short vignettes of campaign workers. Since the loosely organized campaign did not have complete personnel records on every McCarthy worker, she asked staffers to fill out a brief questionnaire and return it to the press room as soon as possible. Armed with these completed surveys, Mazel turned them into short releases. "Dear feature editor," she wrote, "the campaign of Senator Eugene J. McCarthy has attracted young people from all over the country. So many, in fact, that it has often been called the Children's Crusade. Throughout the primaries and on into the summer, these young people have worked for the Minnesota senator. One of these McCarthy workers is from your area and should therefore be of special interest to you and your readers. We are sending you a feature article concerning this young person's activity in the McCarthy campaign. We hope that you will use it in your newspaper. These undated press releases give us a moving testament to this youthful and dedicated energy. Witness these few excerpts. Miss Brangwyn has worked in many phases of the McCarthy campaign. She has done door-to-door canvassing and worked on a sound truck with Senator McCarthy's nieces. Miss Brangwyn is presently working as the receptionist at McCarthy for President National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. Despite all of this work, Miss Brangwyn still had time for sniping, which was putting up McCarthy posters in New York. A police car drove up to her group of snipers, and she was afraid they would be told to stop. However, she recalls, one of the policemen got out of the car and said, "Go right ahead. McCarthy's my man. Good luck, kids." Since April, Susan has been working at the McCarthy for President National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. Her work on the senator's press staff combines her major fields of interest, political science and mass communications. Susan's job includes writing press releases on campaign activities and planning radio and television appearances for McCarthy staff and supporters. When asked about her participation in the McCarthy campaign, Susan replied, "It is the only campaign that would ever make me surface into politics. I am constantly amazed at the amount of work put out for Senator McCarthy and the kind of loyalty he inspires in all his campaigners, including me." Paulette James has been on the national staff of Senator Eugene J. McCarthy since April. She decided to postpone her studies at Barra College of the Sacred Heart and work full-time for the senator at the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. She made this decision because she felt that she had suffered from apathy and realized that McCarthy was speaking to me. And she felt that in this campaign, she could have something to do with shaping tomorrow, and that many other black people feel the same as I do. She strongly believes that McCarthy is the one man and the last man who can unite all bonded minorities. Now, this is one of those moments when working in a collection intersects with reality, my reality as the archivist, as the curator. I was reading this account. Barra College. She decided to postpone her studies at Barra College. Barra College was the place that I had my very first professional position at. It was a Catholic school whose most famous alumna was Mayor Jane Byrne of Chicago. The school no longer exists. Most of the buildings have been razed as part of a development scheme in the north suburbs of Chicago. So there are these interesting intersections. Following Dr. King's assassination, Abigail McCarthy sent out another note to the campaign. "Dear Women for McCarthy, we must pay tribute to an American who in bereavement has exemplified the best that is in us. Coretta King left a promising career as a concert singer to marry a young minister. She was always a loving mother and a dedicated pastor's wife. With her husband, she also sought to serve the cause of justice and peace. He wrote of her that in days of terror, she had been his strength and inspiration. Last week, in the midst of grief, she spoke and acted with beauty, courage, and dignity. And she rededicated herself to the cause of the poor and the method of nonviolence. May women everywhere help to heal this most tragic division in our society. Now, author and activist Darcy Richardson paints this little vignette from the New Hampshire portion of the campaign, what became known as the Clean for Jean movement. Ann Hart, the 20-year-old daughter of Michigan Senator Philip A. Hart, and an organizer in McCarthy's Manchester, New Hampshire office, was responsible for making sure the boys were clean-shaven and the girls properly attired before sending them door to door. Bearded and long-haired males and young women in miniskirts stayed behind, stuffing envelopes and manning the phones. Among those thousands of young women who flocked to McCarthy's campaign that year was former Goldwater girl and future First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton, then a 20-year-old student at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. Daughter Mary, who took a leave of absence from Radcliffe, was also active in New Hampshire and served as the campaign's unofficial troubleshooter. Actress Joanne Woodward was also active in the campaign. Other celebrities joined the fray, including Paul Newman, who made 15 swings across Indiana for McCarthy, Myrna Loy, Rosemary Prince, Phyllis Newman, the Twilight Zone's Rod Serling, Gary Moore, Dustin Hoffman, and Mary Travers of Peter, Paul, and Mary. Now, originally I was thinking I would try to slip in some audio here, but you can go to the U-Media archive and listen to Peter, Paul, and Mary's campaign song. They wrote one. They had to. They were McCarthy folks. There are other little vignettes that pop up in the McCarthy papers. People call McCarthy dull and scholarly, but he has his own kind of charisma, said Mary David, a college student who was campaigning for him in Wisconsin. He has a wonderful sense of humor, and people just naturally liked him. It is a very human kind of appeal, not at all like most politicians. One of McCarthy's most energetic supporters in the state of Wisconsin was Midge Miller, who left her 9 children in her husband's care to stump for the maverick Minnesotan. In New York, Women for McCarthy opened a McCarthy Mart on West 56th Street in Midtown Manhattan. Run by Hedda Henricks, a dynamic woman prominent in civic affairs, the tiny blue and white boutique taken in more than $20,000 in sales and contributions since it opened May 26th, and this was about a month later. And there's a telegram here at the bottom, citizens from McCarthy, appreciate very much all your efforts and hope the boutique doing well. Oregon looks good, Eugene McCarthy. And then we have this description of the Oregon headquarters. From the lobby, a flight of marble stairs led to a chandeliered room for advance, laying the ground for candidates' visits and scheduling. Another for Women for McCarthy. Women for McCarthy, with its own officers and budget, was now active in 17 states and something like 170 offices. Abigail was one of the chief attractions, and there were also the flying nuns. Encountering a nun working at the headquarters, a fellow asked what she was doing there. "Oh," she said brightly, "I just flew out from Minnesota for the weekend to campaign." Thus the flying nuns. In late June of '68, Blair Clark, a national campaign manager, made the following announcement. Women for McCarthy under Mrs. McCarthy's leadership has been one of the most effective political organizations ever seen. Now that the primary period is over and that Mrs. McCarthy must retire from active leadership of this group, the McCarthy campaign is very fortunate in having Ann Allenson, the Democratic National Committee woman from California, take over that direction. Mrs. Allenson is a remarkable organizer with great wisdom on matters of issues and politics. Now, I don't know who wrote that press release. Might have written it a little bit differently, but. So there's a change in leadership. Abigail moves to the side. Ann Allenson steps in. There were many other women involved in the McCarthy campaign in many, many ways. I've just scratched the surface. I wish I could tell you more about the thousands of women all over the country, hard at work, of women literally pouring into the 6 main regional offices in Minnesota, wanting to work for McCarthy, or those who were described in a Women for McCarthy newsletter in this fashion. Although they worked at Amazonian's pace before the New Hampshire primary, the New Hampshire Women for McCarthy haven't quit now that the heat's off. And part of that is in capital letters. In some ways, Kennedy's assassination took the wind out of the campaign. McCarthy and his followers limped into Chicago, exhausted by the fight. Riots in Grant Park and skirmishes on the convention floor didn't improve anyone's mood. But the women for McCarthy were not without hope. In a keynote speech to the Women's Coalition for McCarthy a week before the Chicago Convention, author and critic Maria Mans exhorted her audience, "We can no longer retreat into our homes when, a mile away, fires are destroying the homes of others. We can no longer find refuge in tidy suburbs when nearby cities are cauldrons of misery, hate, and deprivation. Young and old, black and white, rich and poor, we are all in it together now. And if we cannot actually work in the ghettos, in the schools, in the streets, in the government itself, we must throw our entire power behind those who do. Those who are on the side of life, those who are on the side of humanity, those who are, above all, committed to change. We can no longer go on the way we have been, for the simple reason that it no longer works." Nixon may have gained the White House, but McCarthy women, as historian Mary Linehan notes, defined their campaign as a personal and political success. Peace activists, women religious, worried mothers and students, most never active before in politics, crossed generational, racial, and party divides to support a maverick candidate in a moral crusade. They generally found their contributions welcomed and valued, and their leadership encouraged by Senator McCarthy and those who worked for him. While McCarthy women encountered some discrimination and sexual harassment, it did not change their memories of the campaign as an empowering and transformative experience. Together, they drove an incumbent president from office, forced their party to commit to negotiating a peace deal in Vietnam, and brought fundamental change to the rules and structure of the Democratic Party. These successes resulted in a life-changing experience, a sense of shared gender identity, a new respect for what organized women could accomplish, as well as recognition of how women were excluded from real political power. Together, McCarthy women's experiences and realizations fueled the emergence of a promising new feminist politics in the wake of violence, upheaval, and the despair of 1968. Finally, let me leave you with this thought. In a recent interview about her newly released book, Good and Mad, author Rebecca Traister reflected on suburban women who were newly politically active in Georgia. This is a quote from the interview. After the 2016 election, they were so upset that they couldn't hold it in. They yelled. And suddenly they realized the whole time there'd been a woman down the block that they never knew existed. Now they knew about each other and began to talk and began to go to meetings with people who wanted to get involved in elections. The next thing you know, they're spending their every waking moment volunteering, knocking on doors, and registering voters. That is incredibly powerful, and it's a great example of what a power structure hopes to discourage. Power structures try to make sure women don't express their anger and therefore never find each other in angry communion. Women for McCarthy found each other in that communion, and they made a difference. Thank you.
Thanks to our presenters. We actually have a few minutes for some questions. And I'm going to grab the microphone here. So Tim and Kate, if you want to come up.
Questions, questions, questions.
It's not a question really, but a comment for Kate. Carol Bly made a crossword puzzle for her son's high school graduation class. Yes, she asked all the parents. It was in secret, and she asked all the parents for a little nubbin of what would identify your child, and then she made the crossword puzzle.
That's so cute. She kept really good records of all of the people that she had made crossword puzzles for in the collection, and so it was really interesting going through and seeing how many different occasions, how many different businesses, how many different individuals she had, been in communication with making these puzzles.
This is just a comment too, but it's about the Women for McCarthy. Someone I grew up with in Wisconsin actually did do a lot of door knocking for McCarthy, and a number of people who got door knocked thought she was talking about Joe and not Jean.
I should mention too, while Linnea is going to the next questioner, that one vignette of the young woman who had worked on the McCarthy sound trucks with McCarthy's nieces. We have a McCarthy niece here today. Mary Beth, would you just wave, stand up? And I'm wondering if you worked on the sound truck with some of those other women from McCarthy.
Yes, I'm sure.
All right.
My sister Patty and sister Julie also
Okay.
were part of it.
So Mary Beth and I have been working, I think now for 3 years on a film project. Mary Beth is a filmmaker, and sometime soon there will be a very interesting aardvark appearance. Yes, yes. So, but it's good to have you here today. So, yeah.
It was wonderful. It was really, really wonderful.
Thank you.
What happened to Abigail McCarthy after that election, and what was the rest of her life like?
Well, I don't know Abigail's biography except that she and Gene separated. Never divorced. They were both, I think, good Catholics, and divorce was not an acceptable option, but they did separate. And I think Abigail created her own life. And if anybody's got a recommendation for a great biography of Abigail, I would love to know that. Did she do an autobiography? Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Called Public Places, Private Faces, I think.
Yeah, Public Places, Private Faces by Abigail McCarthy. A remarkable, remarkable woman.
Any other questions?
And again, while you're going to that question, I'm just going to make one other observation. In working on this, it's also caused me to reflect. I was a 10-year-old little boy when the campaign was going on in '68. But I sometimes wonder way down deep, as a 10-year-old, what difference it made in my own life that year I experienced the assassination of Dr. King, the assassination of Senator Kennedy, the riots in Grant Park, the unrest at the convention, and going grocery shopping with my mom after some of those riots broke out from Dr. King's assassination, and walking through parts of Milwaukee where the stores were boarded up. What kind of impression, and how am I still kind of living out that 10-year-old's experience from Milwaukee and that 68, which was an amazing, amazing year. The chant in Grant Park, the whole world is watching, the whole world is watching. That's something that just echoes in my being. So.
Well, again, this isn't a question, it is a comment, but my auntie, Elphys maybe, worked very hard for Eugene McCarthy in, during his campaign. And I think, I may be wrong about this, but I think she headed up the campaign in Minnesota. Oh. And she talked often about the experience of the 1968 Chicago Convention. There were
I think
a lot of stories.
The 58 Senate campaign really laid the groundwork because I think by a decade later, there were already a core group of about 2,000 women that had been involved in the Minnesota Women for McCarthy. And it was that nucleus then that you see something else interesting in the records too, because there are lists of all the board members and folks involved with Women from McCarthy, and it's always Mrs. Leonard Bernstein, Mrs. It's like these women had their own first names. Let's give it to them, but the record does not always reflect that. So.
Any more questions for either of our?
Kate, I'm just curious to know what drew you into focusing on Carol Bly's collection out of all of the women's writers' collections that you've been working with in the past few years?
Thanks for that question. It's a good one. What drew me to Carol's papers versus other collections from women writers? I had not really known who Carol was until working here. And so it was only through, I didn't know her sort of public presentation of herself, and I only sort of got to know her more intimately through her archives, which is a sort of really odd experience to get really, you start to feel really close to someone even though you've never met them and never will. And I was also really interested in Carol because oftentimes when I would read about her or encounter her work, I would hear, read something along the lines of, and married to Robert Bly. And so I was really interested to see sort of like what her story looked like without Robert Bly. Who she was if you sort of kind of just look at her and her life, as a person apart from her relationships with other men.
I think we have time for one more question for either of the presenters.
Abigail would want to make sure that you had registered to vote. So register to vote.
That's our public service announcement for the day. All right, thank you for those interesting questions. I would like to encourage you to visit our current exhibit, Festival, Spectacle, and Celebration in the Early Modern World, and that is located on the ground floor in room 15, the Maxine Wallen Center, in our new gallery space down there. And please join us again on November 2nd for presentations from the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives and the Couts Family YMCA Archives. And remember, if you would like a tour, you can meet Chris, your tour guide, in the back of the room. Thank you, everyone, for coming today.